A shell weighs about 90 pounds, and a boy of 19 has just carried his 400th one across an ammunition yard by hand, his knees buckling on the last few feet before he drops it onto a splintering wooden board. His palms are raw. His back has stopped complaining and gone numb instead. Nobody around him looks up. Nobody called it brutal. They called it Tuesday. At least, that's what everyone believed. So how did we get from that, from boys with ruined hands stacking shells one at a time, to a bored driver today lifting 2 tons of canned soup with one gloved thumb in about 4 seconds without looking up from his phone? It starts with a war that ran out of men. By 1917, the boy with the ruined hands was not an unusual sight. Factories across the country had signed enormous government contracts to build shells, rifles, and trucks for a war that showed no sign of stopping. At the exact same moment, the draft was pulling every able-bodied young man out of those same factories and putting him in uniform instead. Owners needed more hands than ever, and the country was actively removing hands from the workforce as fast as it could find them. That's the bleak arithmetic of American industry during the Great War. It wasn't patriotism that built the first powered lift truck. It was a labor shortage with a deadline. A company called Baker Rowlang had already been tinkering with an answer. Around 1915, they built an electric truck designed specifically to handle bombs, hoisting and moving munitions that would otherwise require 2 or 3 men bent double under the weight, breathing sawdust and grease fumes in a cold shed. It wasn't glamorous. It looked like a crate on wheels with a crank, but it moved. Then, in 1917, the Clark Equipment Company, which normally built heavy truck axles, ran into the same problem from a different angle. Workers hauling parts across Clark's own factory floor were slow and exhausted. So engineers bolted together a gasoline-powered, seated platform truck they called the Tructractor. It had no forks. It had no mast. It was, essentially, a motorized wheelbarrow a man could sit on instead of push. It solved one problem beautifully. It got heavy things from one side of a factory to the other, without breaking a man's back to do it. Visitors touring Clark's plant kept asking where they could buy one. Within 2 years, Clark was selling truck tractors commercially and exporting them overseas. There is a class angle hiding in plain sight here. The men who used to carry those shells were not, generally, the men signing the war contracts. It was factory owners and government purchasing officers who benefited first from speed, and workers who benefited second, if at all, from simply not getting crushed. A faster machine was a cheaper machine long before it was a safer one. Still, the Tructractor's design had a very specific hole in it. It could roll a load across a floor. It could not lift a load off that floor and stack it on top of another one. And by the early 1920s, that gap was becoming the industry's next real bottleneck. Factories were producing more goods than their buildings had room to store, and warehouse floor space, unlike labor, could not simply be drafted into existence. Someone was going to have to figure out how to build up instead of out. A warehouse manager in the early 1920s did math that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever paid rent. Pencil scratching across the back of a shipping manifest. Floor space cost money, every square foot of it, and a building could only spread sideways so far before land costs made further expansion pointless. If a company wanted to store more goods without buying more land, there was only one direction left: UP. The trouble was, up requires lifting, and lifting requires more than a motorized wheelbarrow. Yale Towne Manufacturing, a company that had spent the better part of a century making locks, had entered the material handling business around 1919. By 1923, they introduced something genuinely new: an electric truck with a vertical mast and a set of forks, raised and lowered using a ratchet and pinion system borrowed in spirit from elevator technology. For the first time, a load could be lifted higher than the truck carrying it. A worker could slide the forks under a stack of crates, raise them overhead, and set them down on top of another stack entirely. That single mechanical trick, forks plus mast, is the moment most historians point to as the true birth of the forklift as we would recognize it today. Clark answered a year later. Their 1924 Duart tractor used a chain-supported mast of its own, gasoline-powered instead of electric, aimed at heavier industrial loads. Between the two companies, warehouses suddenly had a real choice of machines built to solve the same problem. Stack it, don't spread it. Here is the reframe worth sitting with. It wasn't a bigger building that solved the space crisis of the 1920s. It was a taller stack, and the class angle only sharpens here. A single forklift operator sitting down using a lever could now do the stacking work that used to require a small crew of men climbing ladders and passing crates hand to hand. Those men did not disappear from the economy, but their jobs did. The efficiency that thrilled a factory owner's ledger often meant a shorter payroll on the warehouse floor. There was, however, an obvious flaw baked into all this new height. A machine designed to lift a heavy load several feet into the air was also, by definition, a machine that could tip over. And through the later 1920s, as more of these trucks rolled onto more warehouse floors with essentially no formal safety standards behind them, that flaw stopped being theoretical. By the early 1930s, the forklift had a reputation problem alongside its productivity. These early trucks were narrow, top-heavy, and forgiving of nothing, their thin tires squealing against painted concrete floors on every hard turn. A driver taking a corner too fast with a raised load could feel the whole machine lean and then simply go over, pinning whoever was underneath it. It wasn't recklessness that caused most of these accidents. It was a machine built entirely for speed and height, sold to a market that had not yet been asked to slow down and think about balance. Yale answered first. In 1931, they introduced a fork tilt mechanism, letting an operator angle the fork slightly backward so a raised load leaned into the mast instead of away from it. It sounds small. In practice, it was one of the single biggest tip-over reductions the industry had seen. 2 years later, in 1933, a company called Towne, founded in Cleveland back in 1918 by an engineer named Lester Sears, released their Model L. It was smaller and more stable than most of its competitors, with better visibility for the driver and a design built specifically around tight warehouse corners instead of open factory floors. Meanwhile, a quieter problem was holding the whole industry back. Wooden pallets, the simple platforms these machines were built to lift, had no standard size at all. One warehouse might use boards 40 inches wide. The next, across town, might use something completely different. A forklift built to handle one company's pallets could be nearly useless at another company's dock. Before any of these safety and stability improvements could scale nationally, someone was going to have to agree on exactly how big that plain wooden board should be. Nobody solved that problem in the 1930s. The Depression had cut deeply into industrial spending, and standardizing something as unglamorous as a shipping pallet was nobody's top priority when survival was the more pressing concern. Insurance costs and liability, more than any concern for the men driving these machines, are what pushed companies towards safer designs at all. A crushed worker was, coldly, a lawsuit. A tipped truck was a delay. Both cost money, and money moved faster than compassion ever did in this industry's early decades. What finally forced the pallet question and pushed forklift production into overdrive wasn't an insurance actuary. It was the largest logistical operation in human history, arriving all at once, with absolutely no patience for mismatched wooden boards. By 1941, as the United States prepared to enter a war already burning across 2 oceans, there were an estimated 25,000 forklift trucks in operation nationwide. That sounds like a lot, until you see what the military needed to move. Rifles, rations, fuel drums, artillery shells, entire field hospitals shipped by the ton to bases and beachheads scattered across the planet. At the start of the war, most of that cargo still moved the old way. Quartermaster depots relied on hand trucks and manual labor, exactly like the ammunition yard this story opened in. Officers touring commercial warehouses noticed factories using forklifts and pallets together moved goods faster, with fewer injuries, using far less manpower. So the Quartermaster Corps adopted both, all at once, at a scale nobody in industry had ever attempted. By 1944, depot officers had narrowed years of chaotic pallet sizing down to 4 official dimensions: 32 by 40 inches, 36 by 48, 48 by 48, and 48 by 60, a standard the entire military supply chain could build around. Quartermasters called these loaded platforms sleds and used them to move combat rations and fuel straight off landing craft and across contested beaches without waiting for a proper dock to be built first. The results were almost unbelievable. Between the third quarter of 1943 and the second quarter of 1945, the average tonnage a single depot worker could handle in a shift roughly doubled. Ships loaded with palletized cargo moved 3 to 5 times faster than ships loaded the old way, crate, by hand. And the number of forklifts in military service climbed from around 10,000 in 1939 to more than 60,000 by 1945. A 6-fold increase inside 6 years, feeding everything from Lend-Lease shipments bound for Britain and the Soviet Union to the beaches of Normandy itself. Here is the reframe. This whole story has been building toward. The war was not only won with guns and ships. It was won, in no small part, with a plain wooden board and a machine built to lift it. Notice who ran these machines back home while the war ground on overseas. With so many young men in uniform, American depots leaned harder on women and older workers to keep the supply chain moving. The forklift, invented to solve a shortage of men in 1917, was solving the exact same shortage again, 25 years later, this time at a scale that reshaped how the whole world moved cargo from then on. When the soldiers came home, they didn't leave that machine behind. They brought it with them, straight into the booming peacetime factories and warehouses of post-war America, where it would spend the next several decades quietly becoming one of the most dangerous tools most working people would ever touch. After 1945, forklifts stopped being a wartime specialty and became ordinary. Every factory wanted one. Every warehouse eventually got one, its engine's low hum becoming as familiar as a delivery truck idling at the curb. Toyota, watching all this from Japan, entered the material handling business in 1956, and within a few decades forklifts of every size, gas, electric, and eventually propane-powered, were standard equipment in nearly every industry that moved physical goods. Regulation did not keep pace with adoption. For decades, whether a company trained its forklift operators at all, or let a teenager climb on and figure it out, was largely left up to the company itself. That gap eventually became impossible to ignore. The Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, created in 1971, wrote a specific standard for what it calls powered industrial trucks, mandating formal instruction, hands-on practice, and a documented evaluation before anyone could legally operate one unsupervised. The standard helped. It did not come close to solving the problem. Even decades later, OSHA's own estimates describe a machine that quietly kills at a steady, almost boring rate. Roughly 85 fatalities a year, tens of thousands of serious injuries. Investigators found tip-overs alone account for about 42% of all forklift deaths. The exact same failure Yale's tilt mechanism had tried to engineer away back in 1931. In 2024 alone, the National Safety Council recorded 84 work-related deaths involving forklifts, order pickers, and similar powered platform trucks. It wasn't malice keeping that number steady year after year, decade after decade. It was neglect, wearing the shape of routine. And the deaths were never evenly distributed. Government data shows forklift fatalities concentrated overwhelmingly in manufacturing, around 42% of cases, followed by construction, wholesale trades, and transportation. These are not office jobs. They are the physically demanding, comparatively low-wage roles that keep the rest of the economy stocked, shipped, and shelved, filled by exactly the kind of worker the boy in the ammunition yard would have recognized instantly. By the early 21st century, the forklift had become something almost invisible, specifically because it worked so well. It sat in the background of nearly every store, every factory, every delivery you ever received, doing its job so quietly that most people who benefited from it every single day had genuinely never thought about it once. That invisibility was about to be tested in the most public way imaginable, when the entire system it quietly powered nearly came apart at once. In the fall of 2021, satellites orbiting the Earth photographed something that had never appeared in quite that way before. Dozens of massive container ships lit up at night, anchored in slow-moving lines off the coast of Southern California, waiting simply to unload. This was the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, together the single largest gateway for ocean freight entering the United States, handling roughly 40% of all shipping containers coming into the country. In ordinary times, perhaps 17 ships might wait offshore on a busy day. By the fall of 2021, that number was regularly climbing past 80, then past 100, on its way to a documented peak of 109 ships waiting off the coast on January 9, 2022. Their lights visible from shore every night like a second, uninvited skyline. News coverage at the time blamed ships, blamed factories overseas, blamed a pandemic reshaping how people shopped. All of that was real. But underneath the ships sat a quieter, more specific problem. The same one that had shaped this entire history from the very first chapter. There were not enough people to run the machines. In July of 2021 alone, the American warehouse and transportation industry reported a record 490,000 open jobs it could not fill. Forklift operators, in particular, were in desperately short supply, at the exact moment the country needed more of them than ever to clear backed-up docks before the holidays. The federal government tried to force a fix. The White House announced the Port of Los Angeles would move to 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operations, hoping round-the-clock work could clear the backlog before Christmas. It did not fully happen. The port's own executive director told reporters the port had the physical capability to run all night. What it lacked was enough truck drivers and nighttime warehouse workers to actually staff those extra hours. Sit with the irony of that for a second. A machine invented in 1917 specifically to replace a shortage of manual laborers had, more than a century later, become so essential and so thoroughly staffed by human beings that a shortage of those same humans could stall the entire American economy almost by itself. It wasn't a shortage of ships or goods or even forklifts that emptied store shelves and delayed Christmas presents across the country that year. It was a shortage of hands willing to run the machine that was invented, generations earlier, to save hands in the first place. In the years since, warehouses have leaned harder into automation, betting on self-driving pallet movers and robotic loaders to make sure the next crisis doesn't hinge on finding enough people willing to climb into the driver's seat. But for now, in nearly every warehouse on Earth, it is still mostly a person, sitting down, operating a lever, quietly deciding how fast the modern world actually moves somewhere right now, in a warehouse or a loading dock you've never heard of. Someone slides 2 steel forks under a plain wooden board, the same kind that boy in the ammunition yard once dropped a 90-pound shell onto back in 1917. The wood has barely changed. Everything around it has. That board carried shells through a war that ran out of men, and rations across beaches in a war that reshaped the planet. It sat stacked by the thousands off the coast of California while a country waited on its Christmas presents. Nobody called any of that unusual. They just called it Tuesday. Maybe that's the real twist. The machine that quietly runs the world was never really about the machine. It was always about who agreed to sit in the seat. Next time you pass one, idling by a loading dock, take a second look. It has quietly decided more of your life than you'll ever realize.